What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so we are finally getting back into Fear itself, and we're really covering in this part like the one tie-in that everybody cares about. Really, I would say the one part of the story that most people care about, which is the Uncanny X-Men tie-in, Unstoppable Juggernaut. So it's kind of funny. In these crossover events that Marvel will do, there will just be segments where people are just like, so I don't care about anything else that happens, but I care about like that one thing because it's cool. Like that's okay. At the end of the day, that's really all comics boil down to, just the cool moments. Like that's really it. Like I could cover the entirety of like Chris Claremont's X-Men run, but there's only like a handful of super cool things that anybody would really care about. So like it's one of those interesting things in like comic book events and all that kind of good stuff. But in any event, switching over to the X-Men, this is all post Utopia. Now, for those of you guys who are familiar with this, bear with me while I run over this for the guys who are not. Utopia in the X-Men landscape was basically after the events of decimation, right? Like the Scarlet Witch took away 98% of the mutant powers population, and then you had an event called Dark Reign. So you had like Secret Invasion where the Skrulls basically invade the entirety of Earth and the Marvel Universe. They start replacing superheroes. And so what ended up happening is Deadpool had actually sent information to the superheroes on how to defeat the Skrulls, and then Norman Osborn intercepted the information and then used it to win. And so that goes into Tony Stark being removed as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. Norman Osborn becomes the new director. He disbands S.H.I.E.L.D., creates Hammer, and then he starts Dark Reign. And so in order to like consolidate his power, he basically started trying to get rid of like all these different groups. But then you have like the X-Men. And at the time, the X-Men were still living in Westchester, I'm pretty sure, and they were recovering from the events of decimation. But realizing that Norman Osborn would seize the opportunity to basically oust them, what they did is they left the United States proper, that is to say the continental United States, and they took up residence on an island off the coast of San Francisco. So technically speaking, they were outside of the US government's jurisdiction, but not really, and they were still considered to be part of San Francisco. Now, the way that this happened was actually by way of this chick, Sadie Sinclair. She's basically the one who invited the X-Men to stay in Utopia in San Francisco. He was kind of like a friend for the X-Men, but not really. She appeared in like 15 issues, so she never really had like any meaningful role. But with the X-Men residing in San Francisco and being on good terms with Sadie Sinclair, they basically brief her on what's going on so far. And one of the things that's really pointed out here, and this is pretty important, is this established that Juggernaut is insanely powerful at this point, multiple times over than how he normally is. Because when he has the Crimson Gem of Sid Iraq, as we know the inscription goes, you know, whosoever touches this gem or possesses this gem shall possess the bands of the power of the Crimson Bands of Sid Iraq. Henceforth, you who reads these words shall go forward forevermore, a human Juggernaut. Paraphrasing. When it comes to that level of power, he's already unstoppable in his own right. It's one of those things where like once the Juggernaut starts moving, nobody can really stop him. And he's invulnerable to pretty much every form of physical harm. The only way to really defeat him is to remove his helmet and then use a psychic attack or something along those lines. Because even with his helmet gone, conventional weapons still wouldn't work. He'd be bulletproof. They would just bounce off him. And so when it comes to something like this, what this does is it amplifies his power even that much more. And so it's basically the power of the Juggernaut with Asgardian tech. And it's insane what he's capable of. Not only that, he's basically amassed a whole bunch of followers. And this is really done more for like a ransom act, in the sense that earlier what had essentially gone on, or at least what happens here, is that when the X-Men launched the initial attack, it's really more of like testing to see what they can and can't do, because they don't really know what kind of power the Juggernaut has since it's been amplified. And so when Cyclops and company show up, it's the testing ground. They grab Colossus, they grab Kitty Pryde, they go through and they say, okay, look, like we've got to find a way to defeat this guy. And it kind of works for what it is. But initially, this initial skirmish is disastrous, because like all the X-Men are absolutely, they're decimated. Cyclops is manhandled with no real effort on behalf of Juggernaut. Iceman is taken out in the blink of an eye. And these are some Omega level characters. And so with none of them really being able to stand alone against Juggernaut, Cyclops essentially calls in and says, okay, look, we have more that we have to do here. So this of course leads to the arrival of Magneto. And it's one of the cool things, because you would expect Magneto to be able to slow down Juggernaut or something along those lines. I mean, after all, he is wearing metal, so why not just lift him into the air? But with the enhancements offered by the Serpent, this basically makes Juggernaut and his weapons immune to the powers of Magneto. And so where Magneto stands up and essentially tries to like, you know, block, or I guess catch the hammer of Juggernaut when he throws it, it just keeps moving towards him. Ultimately, it takes Kitty Pryde jumping in the way, phasing Magneto so that the hammer will pass right through him. Otherwise, it would have killed him. And this basically means that like there's no real way for the X-Men to stop him, that Juggernaut truly is unstoppable at this moment in time. And so what they do is they basically say, we need Hope Summers. Now, calling Hope Summers in is no small thing, but you're talking about a character who has the ability to duplicate the powers of anybody around her. her with no upper limit. And that's what she does. She literally goes through and starts tapping in to the powers. So it's basically a mutant with the powers of 1,000 X-Men, or I guess really like a couple hundred X-Men, who in turn is facing off against Juggernaut. And notice this, she does it by the skin of her teeth. What she ends up doing is seizing control of his helmet and then basically melting his helmet and pulling it off. And that's all she can do, because the sheer number of power she's absorbed has been entirely overwhelming. Now, what this does is it allows Emma Frost to basically use Cerebra and then tap into the mind of Juggernaut. And notice this is one of the funny things. Emma Frost is very cavalier in how she does this, right? She's like, okay, his helmet's gone, whatever, I'll just use my telepathy that's, amplified several times over, and then just, shut his mind down or something along those lines. It doesn't work. Not by a long shot. Her psychic mind is effectively like fractured and destroyed. Like it's to the point where she's actually thrown temporarily into a catatonic state because she cannot begin to understand the sheer amount of energy, like psychic energy, rage, fear, anger, the whole 9 yards that Juggernaut is putting off at the moment. It's way more than she knows how to handle, and the Juggernaut moves forward. And so at this point, it's a matter of kind of running a conflict on two fronts. For Cyclops, again, as leader of the team, one part is getting information, seeing if there's a way to defeat him, and the other part is basically creating a stopgap measure. And so what they end up doing is they end up traveling to meet Illyana Rasputin. Now, Illyana Rasputin is currently locked up in a brig, inside the, I guess the X-brig is what it's called. And the reason for this is because shortly before this story, there was essentially the return of Legion. And the reason why the return of Legion had happened is because it was basically the Purgatory, Project Purgatory saga. And it was this idea that after the events of Inferno, which is a way old story that took place in the 1980s, when Jean Grey's clone Madeline Pryor had launched an attack on New York by unleashing demons from this, from basically like the netherrealm basically, where Illyana Rasputin draws her powers. What Project Purgatory ended up doing was realizing this was a power source. And so what they started engaging in was what amounted to like gene splicing the genes of mutants with like demons, and then kind of trying to create their own army of sorts. But what happened was Illyana Rasputin had realized what was going on and the power that was available there, and essentially brought Legion in from a different dimension and basically brought him back to life. But because Legion is so mentally unstable, because he's so insane, he's a credible threat to everyone, that like his powers to warp reality are extreme. So with this kind of a thing in mind, Illyana Rasputin was basically considered by Cyclops to be a credible threat to the mutant community. So she was thrown in the brig. And so seeking out this information and asking her questions, she basically says, look, I can study this and I can take you to where you need to go, but you're gonna have to let me out of this cell in order to do it. So it's a dangerous game that's being played. Something else is going on here. What we end up doing is kind of sidetracking for a second and picking up with some of these forces who are trying to stop Juggernaut, and none of it's working. Like you have Pixie, who's creating like portals trying to get him to different locations, and he just walks right through as if they're not there. You've got Rogue, who tried to like absorb the power of the Juggernaut way more than she could handle, and she ended up shutting down. No one can stop him. And so what ends up happening is they end up taking Illyana Rasputin basically out into the middle of nowhere. She creates a portal and transports everybody but Cyclops to the realm of Sid Iraq. Now, this is where things really get cool. So Sid Iraq is one of the elder demons that existed in the Marvel Universe way back in the day, and was one of the people who retreated. He's also part of the Octessence. The Octessence was a group of super old entities that existed on Earth in the Marvel Universe. And the idea was they had a contest over which one was the most powerful. And so what they ended up doing is, because they couldn't really enter the main Marvel Universe dimension, what they ended up doing was basically creating artifacts, one for each one of these members of the Octessence, and they were placed around Earth. But the idea was that an individual would pick up one of these artifacts, and when they did, they would set the Octessence prophecy in motion. The Earth would be divided into eighths, like an eighth of the Earth's population would be an army for each one of these beings, and then in turn it would just be like a massive war, an end time kind of conflict, and whichever army proved to be victorious would show which member of the Octessence was the most powerful. And so during the Korean War, Kane Marco picked up the artifact that belonged to Sid Iraq, which of course was the Crimson Gem. But with Illyana showing up here, she plays it exceedingly smart. What she'd basically tell Sid Iraq is Juggernaut is using power that is somebody else's. Now, when it comes to Sid Iraq, he's very much like the Old Testament God of Abraham, right? Like, I am a selfish God, and so do not use anybody's power before me. And that's how Sid Iraq functions. That's what he is, because the role that Juggernaut is playing is to serve explicitly for the avatar of Sid Iraq, the avatar of destruction. And so learning Juggernaut has accepted the power of another entity out there basically means that Sid Iraq strips Juggernaut of all of his power, basically takes away everything that Sid Iraq had given him. Now, it does not really mean that Juggernaut is now insanely weak, hopelessly obviously incapable of defeating anybody, he's still insanely powerful. But the problem with this is an avatar has to exist. Someone has to be the new Juggernaut. And so where Ileana Rasputin initially steps up, what ends up happening is Colossus takes her place and says, no, I will be the new host for the Crimson Gem of Sid Iraq. Now, this is where things get kind of crazy too. This is something else that happens. Transitioning back to the forces of the X-Men, there's two major things that happen. The first is that Gambit tries to use his powers to detonate objects by literally touching it to an aircraft carrier that Magneto is sending directly into Juggernaut. And the idea is to bring the aircraft carrier down onto him, and then Gambit will blow it up. It happens, and it still doesn't work. I mean, it's crazy, like the level of power that this guy has. He's OP as hell. But with Colossus taking on the new power of Juggernaut, it is interesting because in the minds of Kitty Pryde, who's basically there, she essentially says like, this will kill Colossus. It'll kill who he was and transform him into somebody else. And that's kind of what happens here, is that when Colossus arrives onto the scene and starts facing off against unstoppable Juggernaut, one of the things he comments on is that like, he doesn't really want to stop. Like he has a desire to just destroy things. As the avatar of Sid Iraq, you seek to destroy, you seek to conquer and to eliminate things. And so what this means for Colossus is that he's following that exact charter. And so showing up here and facing off against Juggernaut, one of the things he says is that in this instance, in this conflict here, that it's not really like Colossus is winning easily. That for where Colossus is basically unstoppable, that with the power Cain Marko still has, he's still faster, he's still stronger, he's still more durable. Like he's still far more capable than Colossus is. The difference here is that Colossus is unstoppable. That's the difference. That's the one thing. Like Colossus literally just starts tearing him limb from limb, because at this point, it just becomes a war of attrition. That Colossus is just like this constant force facing off against Juggernaut, and eventually Juggernaut will wear out. Eventually he'll get tired and he won't be able to fight anymore. And that's exactly what takes place. What ends up going on here is the Serpent realizes what's happening at this moment, the fact that Juggernaut's basically losing, and in response whisks him away, basically snatches him up and sends him directly back over, or brings him directly back to where the Serpent's at, leaving Colossus in its current form. Now, what this does is this goes forward into the future of Marvel Comics and even directly into like Avengers versus X-Men with Unstoppable Colossus. It was an attempt to change his character up, to kind of boost his popularity temporarily, and it worked. Dude, it was a talk of the town. Like every single forum everywhere was like all the time about like Unstoppable Colossus. Can Unstoppable Colossus beat this guy? Can he beat that guy? Can he do this? Can he do that? It just turned into like battle forums all the time, like battle threads everywhere you went. And so it's kind of interesting because in this moment, what ends up happening is that following the departure of Juggernaut, this really leads to the X-Men just kind of going back to business as usual. But one of the things that happens here is Cyclops pays a visit directly to Sadie and essentially says, look, if things are how they are, then what Sadie had intended to do is that if Juggernaut got close enough to Utopia, that what she wanted to do is kind of take out the entire mutant population and Juggernaut in one fell swoop. Now, it wasn't really from a place of being vindictive, it was a practical approach, but Cyclops learned this was the case. Cyclops learned that ultimately she was going to destroy Utopia. And so what he ends up doing is basically having Hope Summers sit outside and in turn, like take away the ability for Sadie to control her own body and says, look, this is how things are. We keep to ourselves. We keep our own. Thanks for giving us a home. But if you believe you're going to be able to walk over the X-Men, that's not going to happen because we have X-Men back there that can turn your blood to mercury. We have X-Men that can make you lose control of your bodily functions. Like we will have them screw up your mind, turn you inside out and make you live the most horrid life you could ever imagine. All the while you don't realize you're just sitting in your living room. So either you can play ball and you can let us be, or we will make you suffer the most horrific experiences you could ever imagine in your entire life. And this is again, continuing the trend of Cyclops falling down the path and becoming somewhat of a darker guy, becoming more extreme and becoming something more akin to a villain. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.